And so as you can see, the chapter will begin with some union wage concerns and what's involved there. The counter to that being management wage concerns and what those are. We'll talk about negotiated wage adjustments, wage negotiation issues, wage surveys, costing wage proposals, and public employee wage and salary issues. Wages are obviously, as we know here, the meat and potatoes of collective bargaining. They're considered often to be the most important and difficult collective bargaining issues. According to industrial research, historically pay level has been positively related to employee satisfaction, and they also it's noted that employees consider their pay to be the primary indicator of the organization's goodwill. And so it's obviously an important issue, and it's a very tangible, concrete issue that union members can put their hands around in comparing their wages in their union with similarly skilled, similarly qualified workers, perhaps in other unions or in the same union, but in other plants or in other states or other geographical areas. And so it does become a very important aspect to the collective bargaining agreement negotiations. And so when we're talking about pay, we're normally defining pay as either pay for time worked or for units of output. Where we're talking about pay for time worked, we're generally speaking in terms of an hourly wage or an annual salary. That's become the predominant means of employee compensation in the United States. When we're talking about pay for units produced, we're usually referring to piecework, and that's still used in many industries, not only as a means of wage determination, but also as a motivational technique. Many piecework systems today provide for a guaranteed salary with an additional rate established for units of output above a certain production level. And so essentially, most employees expect, if we think about it in just a quick phrase, most employees expect a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. And so what this boils down to is this idea of pay equity. And pay equity is really a historic union doctrine of equal pay for equal work that provides one standard pay rate for each job and all employees who perform it. We also talk about this idea of pay equity, and that's often difficult to obtain in the workplace. The idea of equal pay for equal work is a guide that union and management leaders follow and that employees expect to be maintained, but obviously not all jobs involve work of equal value to the organization. And so because of this value consideration, employees understand too that the value of the work leads to different pay grades and different classifications for different jobs. Labor agreements commonly provide for different job classifications being assigned different grades according to level of skill and work demanded. And so as long as the pay grades are fairly structured and evenly applied, employees usually have no trouble accepting differential pay based on job classification and internal wage assignments. And so an example of this would be, suppose you have you run an engineering firm and you have a group of engineers on board. So you may have a entry-level engineer position that has a pay grade 1, a pay grade 2, a pay grade 3, a pay grade 4. And so within that entry-level engineer's position, you have a distinct job description that says this is what the expectations of that position are, this is the education and the skill set required to perform that job, and then within that job you have certain pay grades which could be based on experience, so that associated with those pay grades are obviously different pay scales, and so that as an employee becomes more experienced, gains more skills, can provide more value to the organization, they move through those pay grades until perhaps they get to where they have an engineering mid-level position that also has a separate job description and a separate set of skill and educational requirements and a separate set of pay grades. And so the trick or the knack about it, or the art to it, is to keep all of these, keep the pay grades comparably and equitably paid, so that they serve as a motivation for an employee to want to move through pay grades, to want to move into different job descriptions. And so industrial wage differentials also provide a logical basis for differences in pay among employers in the same labor market. Employees recognize that the relationship between labor and total production costs affects their wage levels. Organizations that are in highly labor-intensive industries are usually less able to provide wage increases than organizations that are in more capital-intensive industries. So, for example, if a specialized chemical processing plant has a few competitors and it increases its wage rates by 10%, it would need to raise prices by only 0.6% to absorb the wage increase, because only 6% of its total production costs would be attributable to labor. However, if we compare that to something like a southern textile firm who raised its wages by 10%, it may need to raise prices by 7% because its labor costs would equal 70% of total production costs. And so this is just an example of, again, the issue that there is this relationship between labor and total production costs, and they do affect wage levels. And so with respect to the industrial labor force, we see where that the union wage gains are generally highest where the employer's ability to pay is high because of discretionary pricing power and profitability. So if the employer can pass increased wage costs on to the customer because they control the marketplace, that is, they're price setters and not price takers, well, then they have more ability to pay higher wages than perhaps an employer who has to sell at the same price, and so they have very little impact over the price to absorb the any wage gains. We also see where unions practice centralized bargaining, or they avoid fragmentation, which essentially boils down to having greater control around the total labor force that the industrial manufacturers or employers are able to draw on, and so it gives the union some leverage. And so management, too, obviously must consider how a change in wages will affect its pricing policy and ability to compete in the marketplace. It's mistakenly inferred often that management wants to minimize labor costs for no particular reason or because employees are not appreciated. The reality is that management needs to maintain competitive labor costs to produce and price their products successfully within their industry. Thus, maintain a competitive industry position is a primary aim of management in negotiations. And so some strategies to negotiating wages under this scenario is first this idea of pattern bargaining. And that's a collective bargaining practice in which a national industry or union strives to establish equal wages and benefits from several employees or employers in the same industry. The steel and auto industries, airline, petroleum, meatpacking, and food industries, among others, have used pattern bargaining. There's also the idea of value added, which is a theory that wages should equal the contribution of labor to the final product. And obviously the issue with respect to value added is who measures, how do we measure, how do we define value, and then how do we quantify it in a way that allows us to use that measure in order to impact the salary and wage levels being negotiated. And that becomes a problem on both the union side and on management side. And so there are certain wage laws that are outside the National Labor Relations Act that affect wage rates. The major compensation legislation regulating employers is the Fair Labor Standards Act, or FLSA, of 1938. It governs several items such as minimum wage and overtime compensation. The Davis-Bacon Act of 1931 regulates employers who hold federal government contracts of $2,000 or more for federal construction projects. It provides that employees working on these projects must be paid the prevailing wage, and in most urban areas, the union wage is the prevailing wage for that particular geographic area. And so, for example, in 2007 in Ohio, the prevailing wage for electricians was $25.56 per hour. The average of all merit shop or non-union electricians was $19.17, which is about a 25% difference. There are similar positions at that time for carpenters, for bricklayers, and what the prevailing wage was for those crafts. And so, according to Davis-Bacon Act, then employers must pay what that prevailing wage is. And this prevailing wage is calculated by the U.S. Department of Labor for each region. And the reason behind this is that governments often award contracts to the firm submitting the lowest bid for certain construction specifications. And so they level the playing field by requiring that all employers in construction projects pay the prevailing wage. And so then we have the Walsh-Healy Act of 1936, and that covers employees with federal contracts of over $10,000. It requires employers to pay overtime for any hours worked over 8 per day at the rate of 1 1/2 times the normal hourly rate. If the employer works days of more than 8 hours within a 40-hour week, he or she will receive greater compensation for the same total hours worked. And so these are important, and if you'll notice, the interesting part of these acts are the time frame, 1931 and 1936. And so this was right after the U.S. economy had gone into the Great Depression, and there were a lot of, unemployment was very high, and there were a lot of people who were willing to work, and they were willing to work for essentially whatever they could make in order to support themselves and their families. And so these laws were created essentially, and as part of one of them, reasons for these laws was to put some regulation in place that prevented management and businesses from taking advantage of the circumstances and taking advantage of the American public. And so how wage rates are defined in an agreement is a critical issue. And there are a couple of different ways of thinking about this. One is through a standard rate, and that's the flatter hourly rate of pay established for each job classification or occupation within a plant or employer, effective for the duration of the collective bargaining agreement. And so normally what happens is, as we talked in our earlier example, there are certain steps or grades within a range, and management will seek flexibility in wage administration by using this range of pay for each grade or category. A common practice in the non-union sector allows management to reward individual differences in employees according to seniority, merit, or quality and quantity of work. And so an alternative to the standard rate is the piece rate system. And the straight piece work is the most common and easily understood individual incentive plan. Essentially, assume that the employee is paid 10 cents per unit produced and completes 100 units in an hour. Then the hour's gross earnings will be $10. That's 100 units times 10 cents. Variations of the straight piece work include a falling piece rate and a rising piece rate. If designed effectively, these piece rate systems can reduce labor costs per unit, reward employees based on their productivity instead of the number of hours worked, and help attract and retain dedicated workers or employees. Plans that use a falling piece rate involve a standard time and rate of production. If the employee produces more than the standard, the gain is shared between the employer and the employee. Plans that use a rising piece rate also involve a standard time and rate of production. Standard hour plans are similar in concept to piece rate plans, except a standard time is set to complete a particular job. So instead of paying the employee a price per piece. So for example, we have an auto mechanic might be given a standard time of 2 hours to tune up an 8-cylinder car. If the worker's hourly rate is $16 per hour and 3 8-cylinder tune-ups are finished in 6 hours, the employee earns $96. So we have some alternatives here with respect to how we define wages. Many multi-year collective bargaining agreements, and so that's a collective bargaining agreement that may be effective on January 1, 2014, and it may cover the next 5 years to January 1, 2020. And so when we have these multi-year CBAs, many of them provide increases in wage rates that are deferred to later years rather than taking effect immediately. These deferred wage rate increases, together with the preferred use of a cost of living adjustments, often make these multi-year contracts desirable for both sides. Management can predict labor costs further into the future with a greater degree of accuracy, and union members feel that their buying power is protected for a longer period of time, and they don't have to worry annually about possible strikes. So there are a couple of ways of negotiating or methodologies to structuring these deferred wage increases. If we talk front-end loading, we're really referring to a deferred wage increase with a larger proportion of the total percentage increase in the first year of the agreement. So a 3-year total wage increase package might be evenly distributed with an equal percentage provided at the beginning of each year. Like 5%, 5%, and 5%, or it could be front-end loaded like 10%, 3% in the second year, and 2%. Under either of those scenarios, the employee gets 15% over the 3-year. Alternatively, we have backloaded contracts which provide a lower wage rate adjustment in the first year with higher increases in later years of multi-year contracts. So, for example, a 10% 3-year adjustment could be 2% in year 1, 4% in 2, and 4% in 3, which totals to 10. In many backloaded contractors, sometimes workers receive no wage increase in the first year. And so union negotiators may emphasize the need for cost of living adjustments or COLAs during the life of the agreement. They contend that the real wage, the purchasing power negotiated into agreement as a wage rate, is eroded by inflation during the life of the agreement. Obviously, unions and employers took some time to get used to this idea of COLAs. Both feared in history, or historically, both feared that COLAs would include pay cuts, which might have occurred because of declines in the consumer price index. And so in the negotiation of a CBA, both labor and management negotiators are careful to specify the exact COLA provisions during the agreement. And so several critical issues must be carefully and completely spelled out, including what is the inflation index, when the increases are to be provided, and these indexes or increases are all based on a base pay. So, what about the change in base pay? And then some labor agreements provide for a maximum COLA increase made by the company during the life of the agreement, which is often referred to as a cap. And here are a couple of those items that we just talked about. With respect to inflation indexes, most provisions use the consumer price index determined by the Bureau of Labor Statistics as a standard for measuring change in inflation. So with respect to the schedule of adjustments, or when are the increases to be paid, the majority of the agreements provide for inflation adjustment 4 times a year subsequent to the reported increase in the CPI. When we talk about a change in base pay, we note that if COLAs are treated as additions to the base pay, then other wage adjustments such as shift differential and overtime will increase after a COLA becomes effective, since they are usually a fixed percentage of base pay, and so the company will find its personnel costs increase by an amount greater than the percentage COLA. And then finally, we talk about COLA maximums. We indicated that these were sometimes referred to as a cap put on the cost of living provisions, and the cap assures management that wage increases because of CPI or consumer price indexes increases will not go beyond a certain total. And so compensation systems whereby management agrees to make a lump sum payment to employees in addition to their regular wages are termed profit sharing or bonus plans. These profit sharing or bonus plans are really a pay incentive system in which employees receive a share of the employer's profit in addition to their regular wages. There's a precise formula generally specifying how profits will be distributed to employees, and that formula is at the heart of the profit sharing plan. And there are several conditions that make these profit sharing or bonus plans favorable from the management perspective. We see, so payment does not automatically carry over to future years, right? Generally, these profit sharing plans are based on the current year's profit. and the formula takes that into account and sets aside a certain percentage of that is then split up according to some other predefined schedule within employees, generally depending on their level of seniority or their management level. Payment does not automatically increase cost of benefits because they have to be, this calculation has to determine the determine what the profit sharing plan is going to be. It's only paid if the company makes a profit, so if the company can afford it, the company doesn't necessarily make it. They're not tied to inflation. Again, it's tied to profit. It's related to productivity because it's higher productivity in theory should increase profitability. And then by having a portion of the profit going to employees, it really does make employees feel more a part of the company. And we often see this with respect to companies' 401k plans nowadays. They don't necessarily always distribute this profit sharing to employees, but they make contributions to the employees' 401k plans, which benefits the employees in that they're, these plans represent their retirement, so it's almost a sort of a forced savings. And then there are provisions for withdrawing from a 401k if it's required. It's just they usually generally come with some very healthy tax consequences as a result of it. And so this table, which is set table 7.3 on page 263 of your textbook, provides the pros and cons of what's referred to as a two-tier wage system. And this two-tiered wage system was established in 1977 at General Motors Packard Electric Division in Warren, Ohio, with the basic concept that you provide continued higher wage levels for current employees if the union will accept reduced levels for future employees. Union leaders believe that they must accept the two-tiered system or accept pay cuts for current workers or face greater layoffs in the future. Management usually claims that the system is needed to compete with non-union and foreign competition. But you can see some of the pros and cons. So the pro is obviously it significantly reduced labor costs, it's the maintenance of higher employment levels, and it provides relief from wage compression between senior and junior employees on the same job, with cons being this idea of resentment. You may have low quality and low productivity from lower tiered employees who may be doing the same job as someone standing beside them who is in one of the other tiers who are getting paid more. You see higher absenteeism and turnover of lower tiered employees and intensification of the preceding problems as lower tiered employees increase in numbers. And so another incentive plan we see often is a group incentive plan that was developed by Joseph Scanlon, in which greater production is achieved through increased efficiency, with the accrued savings being distributed among the workers and the employer. This plan became popular standard in U.S. group incentive plans. It has since become a basis for labor management cooperation above and beyond its use as a group incentive plan. And there are really two primary features. One is that the departmental committees of unions and management representatives meet together at least monthly to consider any cost savings suggestions. And secondly, any documented savings resulting from implementing committee suggestions are divided 75% to employees and 25% to the company. Most other group incentive plans involve programs that set expected levels of productivity, product cost, or sales levels for individual groups, and then provide employee bonuses if the target goals are met. And so essentially what we're saying is that we establish a baseline, and then to the extent that baseline could be with respect to cost, it could be with respect to the amount of labor that's taken, but we establish some baseline, and then we measure the actual performance against that baseline, and to the extent that there are cost savings, and that cost could be through labor, so we use less labor than the baseline, it could be through direct materials, but to the extent we recognize or realize any efficiencies from that baseline, we share those efficiencies or split them between management and labor. And so we talked about this two-tier wage system earlier when we were talking about the exhibit on page 263 or 7-3, where we said it pays newly hired workers with less than current newly hired workers less than current employees performing the same or similar jobs, right? And so unions accept this in order to help preserve job security. And the contract may or may not provide for the eventual merging of the two tiers, and this has increased use in highly competitive industries. So again, this is just this idea of paying the current employees more than future new hired employees. And so an alternative to providing the increase to an hourly or an annual salary of an employee is just this process of lump sum payments. Right? And the most common form of lump sum payment is a flat dollar amount per employee. By negotiating lump sum increases for current employees together with a two-tier system for new employees, an employer can effectively lower base wage rates and total labor costs. Management may also prefer lump sum payments to COLAs or higher wages because their total cost during the contract is easier to predict and they don't increase hourly wage rates. Unions may prefer that they be paid early in the weeks of a new union contract to provide a quick benefit to members. Lump sum payments do not preclude the negotiation of a wage rate increase, but usually management will offer a larger total compensation package in the first year if a lump sum is included instead of a larger base wage increase. And so here we just continue the discussion that with respect to these lump sum payments, that they don't preclude the negotiation of a wage rate increase. And they really came about in most predominantly in 2005, where UAW Caterpillar Landmark contract combined a two-tier pay system with a lump sum increase to lower the base wages paid. And so during the negotiation process, one or both sides may use a different wage level theory to stress economic proposals. One or both parties may bring to light one or more wage theories and issues having an impact on negotiation of rates. Which issues might be stretched during negotiation and whether they're even presented depends on the history of the company's labor relations and the personality of the negotiators. One of the oldest and broadest negotiation issues concerning wages involves the productivity theory, and that's the negotiating position that employees should share in increased profits gained by the greater productivity achieved because of their efforts. At the heart of this issue is the commonly accepted proposition that the organization's productivity or production is a combination of three factors. That's machinery and equipment, employee labor, and managerial ability. Union and management leaders agree that all three share in the creation of profits because they contribute to the organization's productivity. Obviously, the problem here is to determine, when we're looking at, okay, there's increased profitability and there's increased productivity, so how much of that, both of those increases are attributable to either the employee's labor or the machinery and the equipment or managerial ability. And so another issue that's brought up in wage negotiations is the issue of ability to pay. In principle, this issue is similar to the productivity theory. Union leaders emphasize that labor is one of the primary inputs into a company's productivity and therefore profitability. The ability to pay says the financial position of a company and its ability to change its wage rates are general factors involved in negotiations. They are usually a reflection of company profits and will be a basis of the negotiator's wage proposal. The ability to pay concept has severe limitations, though, according to management negotiators. For instance, unions will not press this issue during hard times when profits have decreased or when the company is suffering temporary losses. Unions seldom want to apply the ability to pay doctrine consistently in both good and hard times. Instead, they expect wage levels to be maintained during hard times and increase during good times. Secondly, management will argue that higher profits must be applied back to the company in capital investment. So finally, although profit levels fluctuate greatly, negotiated wage rates do not vary accordingly. And so job evaluation is a systematic method of determining the worth of a job to an organization, and it's usually accomplished by an analysis of the internal job factors and comparison to the external job market. The process is generally part of job analysis. It's the personnel function of systematically reviewing the tasks, the duties, and the responsibilities of jobs, usually to write a job description and minimum qualifications, as well as to provide information for job evaluations. In general, the result of a job evaluation effort is a pay system with a rate for each job commensurate with its status within the hierarchy of jobs in the organization. The job evaluation procedures do not include analyzing employee performance. That is referred to as performance evaluation or performance appraisal. Rather, in job evaluation, the position is reviewed for several carefully selected criteria to determine the relative worth of the job to the organization in comparison with other jobs in the labor market. When we're talking about wage surveys, we're really talking about the collection and appraisal of data from various sources used to determine the average salaries for specified positions in the job market. Generally, both labor and management conduct their own wage surveys to provide information on external labor market conditions. The job evaluation process is used to maintain internal equity for wage rates, but it's important to maintain external equity as well. So both sides want to offer wages that are competitive with the labor market and industry so the firm can attract and retain qualified, productive employees. Union leaders want to provide evidence during negotiations to management and their own members that the wage rates they are negotiating are fair and justified by market conditions. And so many of the changes in contract language that may result in an indirect or direct long-range cost to the company. However, most changes in wages, benefits, and COLAs are direct and usually substantial cost increases. Other types of changes, such as layoff provisions, seniority determinations, and subcontracting, may result in indirect costs to the company. And so the methods of determining the financial impact of a contract change, such as a total annual cost, or cost per employee per year, or percentage of payroll and cents per hour, is what this process of costing is referring to. The costing of labor contracts is obviously a critical aspect in labor bargaining negotiations. Both sides need to estimate accurately the cost of the contract provision so that it can be intelligently discussed and bargained for by either side. If this is an item that ultimately is given up by one side so that another provision can be gained, then its relative weight is best determined by knowing its costs. And so the largest single cost incurred by most corporations is labor cost. And so in this idea of costing again, we can see a couple of methods commonly used, and those include annual cost, and that's where the total sum expended by the company over a year on a given benefit, and it usually the sum excludes administrative costs. Most companies make computations that arrive at an annual cost of a wage agreement or benefit. Then we can talk about cost per employee per year, which is determined by dividing the total cost of the benefit by either the average number of employees for the year or the number of employees covered by a particular program. And then we also talk about cents per hour, which is derived by dividing the total cost of the benefit or wage provision by the total productive hours worked by all employees during the year. And so there are a couple steps or elements to determining the compensation cost. And the first step in determining this is to develop the basic wage compensation figure. And this represents an employee's general rate of pay per unit or hour, disregarding any payments for items such as overtime, pension benefits, and bonuses. The next step is to determine this roll-up. And so as hourly wage increase, many benefits also directly increase because they're directly tied to the wage rate or base rate of employees. And one of the biggest costs here you can think of as Social Security taxes. That Social Security tax currently in 2014 is 7.65% for the employer and 7.65% for the employee. And so as an employee's hourly wage rate increases, the amount of employer-paid Social Security taxes also increases. So this direct increase in benefits caused by a negotiated wage increase is referred to as the roll-up. Roll-ups may also be called add-on or creep. All three terms refer to other costs incurred which automatically increase as wage rates are increased. These costs must be rolled up into the total cost of the negotiated wage package to reflect accurately the total cost that will be incurred. And some of the examples we see here are Social Security, we just talked about that, life insurance, which is often paid based on an employee's annual earnings. So if those earnings increase, the life insurance coverage would increase, and thus the cost would increase to the employer. Overtime pay and shift differential. So overtime is usually, and shift differentials are computed as a percentage of the base wage. So it could be time and a half, it could be double time, it could be triple time. There are a lot of, depending on whatever the contract says. And so if the base pay increases and time and a half or double time or triple time necessarily must increase. And then there are pension benefits. And normally the pension benefit formula includes employees' average annual wages. So an increase in these wages increases the employer's funding liability for the pension. And so at all times during negotiations, both labor and management maintain their estimated cost of wage and benefit items on which they have reached agreement. So as additional economic items are proposed, both sides know exactly the total cost of the new contract. Then they can decide whether the cost of the new items would increase the total cost of the agreement beyond an affordable level. And so this concludes our discussion of Chapter 7. As we said early on, wages and wage rates and the labor cost and salary rates are probably the most important aspect to labor negotiations. So I would ask that you go back and read the chapter very closely and make sure you're comfortable with all of the concepts presented there. Don't let this presentation serve as the in place of that. And then please don't hesitate to contact the course facilitator with any questions. And thank you for your time.